first time I really noticed him. I didn't grow up with verses echoing through my childhood home or worship songs humming in the kitchen while dinner simmered. Ours was a house where God was more concept than companion, and the Bible sat unopened on a bookshelf like an heirloom no one quite knew what to do with. But even in that silence, even in that spiritual unfamiliarity, I believe now that God was already working behind the scenes. I just didn't know how to see it yet. My freshman year of college was when things started to fall apart. The excitement of independence quickly unraveled into anxiety I didn't have the language to explain. I felt like I was performing in a life I hadn't rehearsed for. Classes were harder than I expected. My friend group felt surface level. My future, once so full of promise, looked like a fog I couldn't see through. I started waking up with a weight on my chest that wouldn't go away, and I went to sleep hoping I'd feel different in the morning, but I never did. One night, with the stress of finals pressing in and an essay due I couldn't even begin, I found myself in the dorm common room. It was past 2 a.m., and everyone else was asleep or out partying. The vending machine hummed behind me. My laptop glowed in front of me, and I sat there, frozen, unable to write a single sentence. I felt like a fraud, like I didn't belong anywhere. That night, for the first time in my life, I considered quitting everything, not just school, but all of it. I was tired of trying. And then something happened. I still can't explain it, except to say I felt drawn to open my suitcase, the one still half unpacked from 3 months earlier, and dig out a little black Bible someone had given me at graduation. I didn't know where to turn, so I opened it randomly, and my eyes landed on Psalm 34:18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. I didn't even know what I believed, but those words struck something deep inside me. I read them again and again. It felt like they had been written just for me, for that exact moment. My heart crushed, my spirit worn out. I whispered, barely audible, "If you're real, if you care, I need you." Nothing around me changed. The vending machine still hummed. The cursor still blinked on the empty Word document. But something inside me shifted. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, it was subtle, like the first breath after being underwater for too long. I didn't write the essay that night, but I walked back to my room feeling steadier, like I wasn't alone. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing small things. A classmate inviting me to a campus ministry event, a professor encouraging me after class, a stranger smiling at me on a day I was convinced I was invisible. I began reading that little Bible more, not because I suddenly became holy, but because I was desperate for something real. And the more I read, the more it felt these ancient words were somehow speaking into my very modern mess. One Sunday, I finally accepted the invitation to church. I sat in the back, arms crossed, unsure. But when the pastor spoke about a God who doesn't wait for us to have it together, a God who meets us in the middle of our mess, I felt something crack open inside me. It wasn't just hope. It was the possibility that I wasn't too far gone, that maybe God wasn't as distant as I had assumed. The days didn't magically get easier. I still struggled with anxiety. I still had nights where sleep wouldn't come, but now there was a thread of grace running through it all. A new awareness that I wasn't navigating this alone. Every time I opened scripture, I wasn't reading a rule book. I was meeting a person, one who saw me, one who wasn't scared off by my mess. It was like discovering color after a lifetime of grayscale. Slowly, Gently, things began to come alive. I started praying, not with eloquent words, but with honesty. Some days it sounded like, "God, I don't know what I'm doing." Other days it was just silence, but I believed He heard me anyway. And over time, the weight I carried didn't disappear, but I no longer carried it alone. Looking back now, I realized that season wasn't just hard, it was holy. It was the beginning of learning to see God not as a distant judge, but as a present Father, a comforter, a healer, a guide. And while I had no idea what the road ahead would hold, I knew I didn't want to walk it without Him. That's how my story with grace began. Not in a revival tent, not during some grand emotional altar call, but in a quiet dorm room under fluorescent lights with a Bible verse and a whispered prayer. That's when I first noticed Him, and He never stopped noticing me. When the familiar became faithful. Faith is not forged in fireworks, but in footsteps. I discovered this not in a dramatic encounter or a sudden miracle, but in the quiet, consistent rhythm of choosing to trust every day. I remember those first few weeks after returning to church regularly. It felt awkward at first, like stepping into someone else's family reunion where I didn't know if I belonged. But there was something persistent about it, an unseen draw pulling me forward, even when part of me wanted to run. At first, I only came for the music. The way the band would play those worship songs, it stirred something inside of me I didn't know how to name. It wasn't just emotion, it was memory and longing and peace all braided together. I didn't know the lyrics at first, so I'd watch others sing with hands raised and eyes closed, stray, and I'd wonder what it felt like to trust someone that much. Then one day, without realizing it, my own lips moved. I was singing. Not because I fully believed, but because I wanted to. The campus ministry began to change from a place I visited to a people I belonged to. There was something sacred in the ordinary moments. Free pizza on a Tuesday night, someone praying for me without knowing I needed it, laughter over inside jokes during small group. I wasn't just attending anymore, I was abiding. Faith stopped being a concept and started becoming a rhythm. I began volunteering, not because I was qualified, but because I wanted to be useful. I passed out flyers, helped stack chairs. I led a devotional even though my hands were shaking. And through it all, God was whispering, "This is what faithfulness looks like." Classes were still hard. My anxiety didn't vanish. But I noticed something shift in how I walked through those struggles. I wasn't spiraling the way I used to. There was a steadiness I couldn't explain. When I felt overwhelmed, I'd step outside between classes, close my eyes, and just whisper, "Be with me." And somehow He was. Late one night, I had a conversation with a leader from ministry. We sat under string lights in the courtyard, and I confessed that I didn't feel spiritual enough, good enough, strong enough to be doing any of this. He looked me in the eye and said, "God's not asking you to be enough. He's asking you to be His." That sentence hit me like a wave. I didn't need to strive. I just needed to stay. I started seeing God in all the quiet places. In the early morning sun hitting the windows of the library, in the way someone held the door open, in the verse that popped up in my notifications exactly when I needed it, in my own breath, slowing down during worship. He was everywhere, not just at the altar, but in the algebra classroom, in the cafeteria line, in my walk back to the dorm. And I learned slowly that faith is built not just on the mountaintops but in the mundane, that returning to God over and over, even on the days I felt numb, was itself an act of worship. Some mornings, all I could do was read one verse. Some weeks I didn't pray at all. But he stayed. He didn't scold me or withdraw. He kept showing up, through friends, through sermons, through silence. And each time I came back, I felt more known, not less. There was no lightning bolt, no grand sign. Just this. The realization that the God I first noticed in the crisis was the same God holding me together in the calm. That his grace wasn't just for the desperate, but also for the daily. That's how the familiar became faithful. And I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't going anywhere. Learning to walk, not run. Faithfulness, I was learning, wasn't about speed. It wasn't about how quickly I could grow or how fast I could memorize scripture or lead others. It was about walking, one steady, small, quiet step at a time. And learning to walk in faith meant learning to walk through doubts, setbacks, and all the places I thought God had forgotten about. There was a season about halfway through my sophomore year when things felt dry again. Not tragic, just dry. I wasn't in crisis, but I wasn't excited either. My prayers felt repetitive, worship felt mechanical. I was doing all the right things, still volunteering, still going to small group, but my soul felt like it was just going through the motions. I felt like I'd plateaued. I remember one night sitting in my car after a ministry event, staring at the dashboard lights and whispering, "God, where are you?" Not out of anger, just confusion. I thought maybe I had done something wrong. Maybe he had moved on to someone more on fire, more obedient, more passionate. But as I sat in that quiet space, I remembered something my mentor once said. Sometimes the silence is not a punishment, it's a sign of trust. God wasn't absent. He was inviting me to grow deeper, to mature beyond the feelings. It was during that stretch of spiritual dryness that I began to study the Psalms in a new way. David's words weren't always victorious. Often they were raw, uncertain, even angry. But they were honest. And that gave me permission to be honest too. I started writing my own Psalms in a journal. Some joyful, some frustrated, some just full of questions. And in that honesty, I felt God meet me again. Not in fireworks, but in presence. During those months, I was also navigating academic pressure. I had changed my major and was struggling to keep up. My GPA wasn't where I wanted it to be. Friends around me seemed to be thriving, getting internships, building their resumes. I felt behind. Less than. Like I had missed the window of success. But in the middle of all that, one verse kept returning to me. He who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion. Philippians 1:6. I clung to that promise, even when I didn't feel it. I began to trust that God's timeline wasn't broken just because mine didn't match the people around me. And he began opening my eyes to something bigger. Ministry, I realized, wasn't confined to the four walls of our weekly meetings. It was in the way I spoke to my classmates, the way I encouraged someone who had bombed a test, the way I noticed the lonely kid in the cafeteria. God was teaching me to live missionally, not just ministerially, to carry his grace into places where sermons wouldn't be preached, but lives were still aching. I joined a mentorship group that semester. 5 students and a campus pastor who met every Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. It was early. I hated mornings. But I went, bleary-eyed and often with coffee in hand, and those meetings became sacred ground. We talked about real things: dating, anxiety, calling, failure. No one pretended. And in that authenticity, healing happened. I didn't walk away from every session with answers, but I always walked away with peace. That spring, I was asked to share my testimony at a student retreat. I panicked. Who was I to tell my story? What if I messed up? What if I cried? But I said yes, and when the time came, I stood on a little wooden stage under a string of fairy lights and told the truth. About my anxiety. About that dorm room night with Psalm 34:18. About how I was still figuring it out. And when I looked up, I saw faces, some nodding, some crying, some just listening, and I knew it mattered. God had taken my brokenness and used it to speak. Afterward, a girl came up to me and said, "I thought I was the only one who felt that way." And that sentence alone made every ounce of fear worth it. That's when I started to understand that testimony isn't about being perfect. It's about being real. And that God uses the real more than He uses the rehearsed. There were still hard days, exams that didn't go well, group projects that drained me, days when prayer felt dry and worship felt like effort. But I had begun building a foundation that was deeper than emotion. I wasn't chasing mountaintops anymore. I was learning to trust the God of the middle. My quiet times weren't always Instagram-worthy. Sometimes it was 5 minutes with a verse on my phone while rushing to class. Sometimes it was sitting in the back of the chapel, just breathing. But He met me there. Over and over. Gracefully. Faithfully. By the end of that year, something in me had shifted. I was no longer the girl who just needed God in crisis. I was becoming the one who wanted Him in calm. Not because I feared falling apart again, but because I had tasted what it meant to be held. And once you've known that kind of love, you don't want to let go. That's what faithfulness looked like in that season. Not flawless devotion, but consistent returning. Not perfect prayers, but present ones. And the more I returned, the more I realized He had never once turned away. The season I wanted to quit. There comes a point in every journey of faith when you hit a wall. Not just a small bump, but a moment where you genuinely wonder if you can keep going. For me, that moment came during the fall semester of my junior year. Life didn't implode all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a sweater caught on a nail, tugged thread by thread until it felt like nothing was holding me together. I had been doing all the right things, still serving, still leading, still showing up. But inside, I was bone-tired, spiritually, emotionally, physically exhausted. The very things that once gave me life now felt like burdens. Ministry had become a duty. Prayer had become quiet resentment. And God, He felt distant again, like He was watching from a high place while I stumbled through the valley below. What made it worse was that everything looked fine from the outside. People still came to me for advice. I was still asked to lead worship, still invited to leadership meetings, but I was barely hanging on. Every smile was a mask, every yes a weight. I started wondering, what if I just stopped? What if I stopped leading, stopped showing up, stopped pretending? Would anyone notice? Would God care? In that space of silent burnout, I began to isolate myself. I skipped small group, stayed quiet in group texts, and even started missing church. Not because I stopped believing, but because I didn't have the energy to believe out loud. I felt like a fraud, like I was holding up a banner that said faithful, while inside I was falling apart. One afternoon I found myself wandering into a chapel I had never visited before. It was small, dimly lit, and empty. I sat in the back pew, arms crossed, heart hardened, and whispered the most honest prayer I could. God, I don't know how to keep doing this. There was no lightning bolt, no dramatic moment, but in the quiet, a verse came to mind. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Matthew 11:28. Rest. That's what I was missing. Not just sleep or a vacation, but soul-deep rest. the kind that comes from letting go of striving. I realized I'd been trying to earn God's presence, perform my way into His favor, carry faith like a burden instead of receiving it as a gift. And in that chapel, something shifted. I didn't suddenly feel strong, but I felt seen. I didn't walk out full of fire, but I walked out less alone. I started pulling back, not from God, but from the hustle. I said no to some leadership roles. I took time off from serving. I met with a campus counselor and started naming the things I had buried under busyness. And slowly, God met me in the stillness. Not with demands, but with grace. He didn't scold me for being tired. He sat with me in it, like a friend who doesn't need to fix you, just wants to be near. During that season, a friend gave me a book called Ruthless Trust by Brennan Manning. One line pierced me. Faith means trusting in advance what will only make sense in reverse. I didn't understand why I had to go through burnout, but I began to trust that God wasn't wasting it, that He was pruning, not punishing, healing, not hiding. Community became lifeline again, not because I was strong, but because I was finally willing to be weak in front of others. I told my small group the truth. I let people pray for me. I cried in front of friends who didn't try to fix me, just hugged me and said, "You're not alone." And in that breaking, God began rebuilding. Not with new assignments or platforms, but with peace. With small moments, a song on the radio, a verse in a journal, a sunrise that made me breathe again. Faith was no longer something I carried, it was someone carrying me. I started meeting regularly with a mentor who didn't pressure me to perform but simply asked, "How's your soul?" That question unraveled me every time, because it forced me to be honest. Not just about my schedule or responsibilities, but about the state of my heart. And honesty, I discovered, is the beginning of healing. By the end of that semester, I wasn't leading worship, I wasn't organizing events, but I was becoming whole. Slowly, quietly, deeply. And I realized that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is not to keep striving, but to stop and let God love you where you are. He had proven faithful, not because I had been impressive, but because He never stopped being present. Even when I tried to quit, He stayed. Even when I wandered, He waited. And in that, I discovered a deeper truth. God's faithfulness isn't dependent on my strength. It meets me in my surrender. Faith doesn't always look like climbing mountains. Sometimes it looks like resting at the base, breathing deep, and letting God remind you, "I'm still here." And that, in itself, is enough. Stepping into deeper waters. If the season of burnout taught me how to rest in God, then the season that followed taught me how to trust Him with risk again. After I stepped back from ministry responsibilities and let my soul breathe, there came a moment when God began nudging me forward again. But this time it felt different. It wasn't a push rooted in pressure, but an invitation rooted in peace. The question He whispered wasn't, "Are you ready to work again?" It was, "Are you willing to trust me again, even if it looks different this time?" Trust, I discovered, isn't just about believing God can catch you. It's about being willing to leap. And for me, the leap came when our campus ministry announced a new outreach program, something completely outside my comfort zone. We were going to partner with a local shelter, offering meals, prayer, and conversation to the unhoused community downtown. The idea of serving in that capacity scared me. It was messy, unpredictable, vulnerable, and honestly, I didn't feel qualified. I still felt fragile from my own healing, but the gentle voice of God kept inviting, not insisting, "Come with me, you won't go alone." So I said yes, not boldly, but quietly. And that yes opened the door to some of the most powerful encounters I'd ever experienced. Each Friday evening, we'd bring food, sit on curbs and sidewalks, and simply talk to people. No agenda, no performance, just presence. And in those raw, unscripted moments, I saw God's grace in ways I never had in a church pew. One man, John, told me how he used to be a youth pastor before addiction took everything. Another woman, Carla, sang old gospel hymns between bites of her meal. Their stories weren't tidy, they were tangled, but God was in them, working, healing, redeeming, just like He had done in me. There was one evening that marked me deeply. It was freezing. We were handing out blankets and coffee, and a woman named Denise took my hand and said, "I prayed for someone to remind me I wasn't invisible." I didn't have eloquent words. I just squeezed her hand and whispered, "You're seen, you're loved." That night, I went home and wept, not from sadness, but from awe, because I realized God had taken my brokenness and used it as a bridge. My weakness became a way for someone else to feel seen. My restoration became someone else's reassurance. I wasn't just being healed, I was being sent. And in that I understood something profound. Faithfulness isn't just about showing up for church. It's about showing up where Jesus would, on sidewalks, in shelters, in broken places. It's about letting God use your past not as shame, but as testimony. I started sharing my story more, one-on-one with students, in small group settings, even writing a blog that somehow reached people across the country. I didn't tell it to impress. I told it to point. Because if God could meet me in a lonely dorm room, in a silent chapel, in a season of burnout, then He could meet anyone, anywhere. I began to see every yes to God not as a task, but as a thread in a larger tapestry. He was weaving something beautiful out of every moment of surrender. And the more I leaned in, the more I saw that this journey of grace wasn't about climbing ladders or achieving spiritual status. It was about following Jesus wherever He led. Even if it was uncomfortable, even if it was slow. By the time I graduated, I wasn't the most popular leader. I didn't have the flashiest testimony, but I had something deeper. A confidence not in myself, but in His faithfulness. A rootedness that came from walking through fire and finding He never let go. Today, I carry that story with me, not as a badge, but as a reminder that grace isn't a one-time rescue, it's a daily river. And God, in His kindness, invites us not to just dip our toes, but to step deeper, deeper into trust, deeper into love, deeper into the kind of faith that doesn't always roar, but remains. So if you find yourself in the middle of your own mess, may this be your reminder. God isn't waiting for you to get it together. He's waiting to walk with you through it, one honest step at a time. And that is where the testimony begins. If this story resonated with you, I'd love for you to share it with someone who might need it. Leave a comment below. Let's talk about how God is meeting us right where we are. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. You are not alone, and your story is still being written.